The rain was coming down in sheets, the cold water soaking through her thin jacket as she stood in front of the hospital entrance. Her hands were trembling, not from the cold but from the fear twisting through her chest. Her breath fogged in the chilled air, and her heart hammered painfully against her ribs. She hadn't seen him yet, not since the accident. His parents had called her 2 days ago, their voices thin and desperate over the phone. "He needs you," his mother had said. And so here she was. She pushed open the heavy glass doors, her shoes squeaking against the wet tile floor. The sharp smell of antiseptic burned her nose, and the low hum of medical equipment buzzed through the quiet hallways. She spotted his mother first, sitting in one of the waiting chairs. Dark circles framed her tired eyes, and her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. She stood when she saw her. "Thank you for coming," his mother said. Her voice was rough with exhaustion. "How is he?" she asked quietly. His mother's lips tightened. "Angry. He won't listen to anyone." She swallowed the lump rising in her throat. "We need someone to take care of him," his mother said. "He listens to you. He trusts you." He stiffened. "I'm not a nurse." "We'll pay you," his father's sharp voice cut through the quiet hallway. He stood behind his wife, his gaze hard. "Whatever you want." "I don't want your money," she whispered. His mother's eyes softened. "Please, just talk to him." She nodded slowly, her heart hammering painfully against her ribs as she followed his mother down the hall. The hospital room was dimly lit, the blinds pulled tightly shut. He was sitting upright in the bed, his dark hair tousled and his face drawn with exhaustion and pain. His leg was elevated, the thick bandages wrapped tightly around his knee. Her breath caught in her throat. He glanced toward the door when she entered, his dark eyes narrowing. "What are you doing here?" His voice was cold and sharp. I heard what happened," she said softly. He scoffed, running a hand through his hair. "So what? Did they send you to babysit me?" She hesitated. "I wanted to see you." "Well, you've seen me," he said bitterly. "You can go now." She bit her lower lip, stepping closer. "You don't have to push me away." His eyes darkened. "You don't have to stay." "But I want to." His lips curled into a hard smile. "Why?" "Because I care about you." His gaze softened for a moment, just a flicker, before he masked it beneath indifference. "That's your problem." Her chest tightened painfully. She crossed the room and sat in the chair beside his bed. "I'm not leaving." "You should," he muttered. "I won't." The first few days were hell. He was angry, at himself, at the doctors, at the world. He threw things across the room, yelled at the nurses, refused to cooperate with the physical therapists. But she stayed. "You have to try," she said one afternoon as she pushed his wheelchair toward the therapy room. He scowled. "What's the point?" "The point is to get better." "I'm not going to get better," he snapped. Her hand tightened on the handles of the wheelchair. "You don't know that." He twisted his head to look at her. "You're wasting your time." She leaned down, her face close to his ear. "You don't get to give up." His gaze sharpened. "You don't get to push me away," she whispered. "Not this time." He was getting better. It happened slowly at first, small victories that barely seemed like progress. He started being able to stand for longer periods of time. His hands were steadier when he held onto the parallel bars in physical therapy. The frustration in his eyes gradually softened as his body began to cooperate with him again. She was there for all of it. Every session, every painful step, she was there holding his hand, encouraging him when he wanted to give up. On the days when his body ached so badly that he wanted to throw something across the room, she would sit beside him and calm him down. She wiped his tears when he thought no one was watching, and when the pain threatened to drag him under, she stayed. "You've got this," she whispered into his ear one afternoon as he gripped the edge of the therapy bars. His face was twisted with pain, his jaw clenched so tightly the veins in his neck stood out. "I can't," he breathed, sweat pouring down his forehead. "You can." "I'm not strong enough." "You are," she insisted. "You've come this far. One more step." His gaze darkened. His hand trembled. "Come on," she urged, reaching out her hand toward him. One step at a time. He stared at her hand, and after a long hesitation he took it. And then he took a step. And another. And another. When he reached the end of the bars, his breathing ragged, his face pale with effort, she smiled. "You did it." He stared at her, his dark eyes wide and vulnerable. His hand tightened around hers. "I couldn't have done it without you," he whispered. Her heart soared. Once he began to regain his strength, things started changing. The hospital visits became less frequent. He no longer needed her to wheel him down the hallway. He started walking again, first with a cane, then on his own. He grew stronger with every passing day. And soon, it was like the accident had never happened. He started smiling more, the smile that made her heart race and her chest tighten. And they started spending more time together. They went to coffee shops, sat across from each other while sharing quiet conversations about nothing and everything. Sometimes he would reach across the table and brush his fingers against hers. And when he smiled at her like that, with that softness in his eyes, it made her heart race. One night he invited her to a party at one of his friends' houses. "I don't know if I should go," she said nervously. He smiled. "Why not?" "I don't know your friends that well." "You know me," he said, his eyes glinting. "That's enough." Her cheeks flushed. "Okay." They arrived at the party together. The house was packed with people, music blaring from the speakers, and the air heavy with the scent of alcohol and smoke. He stayed close to her side, his hand brushing her lower back as they navigated through the crowd. "Want a drink?" he asked. She smiled. "Sure." He handed her a glass and leaned in close. "Relax. Have fun." She was about to say something when a friend of his approached them, a tall guy with light brown hair and a broad grin. "Hey," his friend said, clapping him on the back. "Good to see you walking again, man." "Yeah, it's been a while," he replied. The friend's gaze shifted toward her. "So, are you guys a thing now?" Her breath hitched. Her heart pounded. But then he laughed. "No," he said, shaking his head. "We're just friends." The smile slipped from her face. "Oh," his friend said, glancing between them. "Really? I mean, she's been around all this time. We thought." "It's not like that," he cut him off sharply. Her heart cracked. His friend shrugged. "If you say so." Her throat tightened painfully. The friend left, and an awkward silence settled between them. She forced a smile. "I think I need some air." "Hey," he reached for her hand. She pulled away. "I'm fine. Just need a minute." She hurried toward the balcony, her chest aching. She wrapped her arms around herself and took a shaky breath. Just friends. That's all she had ever been to him. Later that night, after the party, he walked her home. The city was quiet, the cool night air brushing against her skin. "I'm sorry about earlier," he said. Her steps faltered. "Why?" "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." She turned toward him, her chest tightening. "Is that really how you see me?" "What? As just a friend?" He hesitated. His gaze darkened. "I care about you," he said slowly. Her heart lifted. "But..." Her smile faded. "But what?" "I don't love you like that." Her breath caught. "What?" "I thought you knew," he said softly. "I never meant to lead you on." Her chest twisted painfully. "You kissed me." "I know." "You held my hand." "I know." "You said I was the reason you got better." "You were." "Then why?" "Because I care about you," he said, his voice low. "But I'm not in love with you." Her lips parted, but no sound came out. "You're my best friend," he said. "But I can't give you more than that." She backed away slowly, tears burning behind her eyes. "I need to go," she whispered. "Wait." But she didn't. She turned and walked away. A week later, she saw him with someone else. She was walking through town when she spotted him sitting at an outdoor cafe with a girl. A tall, blonde girl with bright eyes and a perfect smile. She was laughing, her hand resting on his arm. And he was smiling back at her, the smile he used to give her. Her stomach twisted painfully. Emily noticed her frozen state and touched her arm. Sophia? Her breath shook. It's nothing. But it wasn't. Over the next few months, it became painfully clear that he was moving on. He started dating the blonde girl. They posted pictures together on social media. Him holding her hand, her kissing his cheek, the two of them smiling together at parties. And then 2 months later they broke up. And 2 weeks after that he started dating someone new. A pattern. He had moved on and she had been left behind. I can't stay here anymore, she told Emily one evening as they sat in her apartment. Emily's eyes widened. What? I can't keep seeing him, she whispered. It hurts too much. Emily frowned. Where will you go? I don't know, she admitted. But I need to leave. 2 weeks later she packed her bags. She stood at the window of her apartment looking out over the city lights. This had been her home for so long. But it had also become the place where her heart was broken, over and over again. Her phone buzzed. Are you really leaving? Her fingers hovered over the screen. She typed back, yes. Pause. Then, don't go. Tears burned her eyes. He typed, I have to. She set down the phone and walked out of the apartment. Her chest was hollow, her heart aching, but for the first time in a long time she felt free. She walked toward the taxi waiting downstairs, slid into the back seat and didn't look back. She was done being an option. From now on she would be her own priority. She never thought she would feel normal again. After leaving the city, after leaving him, she had felt like a ghost. Drained. Like some vital part of her had been torn away and she wasn't sure it would ever grow back. But time had a way of softening the sharp edges of grief. It wasn't easy. The first few weeks were hard. She'd wake up in the middle of the night, disoriented, wondering where she was. The absence of his presence, of the sound of his voice, of his gaze lingering on her, haunted her more than the memories themselves. But slowly life began to piece itself back together. She moved to a small city far enough from the past but not completely disconnected from it. It was a quieter place. Cobblestone streets lined with flower shops and cafes, colorful storefronts with old-fashioned windows, the hum of life without the noise of the chaos she had left behind. Her apartment was small but comfortable, a single-bedroom space with a large window overlooking the street below. She bought mismatched furniture from thrift shops and decorated the walls with simple paintings and old books. And then one afternoon she found a job. It was a little corner cafe on the main street, Rosie's. The owner, an older woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, had been desperate for help. Do you have experience? Rosie asked, eyeing her with curiosity. Not much, she admitted. Rosie smiled. Well, it's not rocket science. Can you handle a coffee machine? Yes. Can you smile at customers? She hesitated, then smiled faintly. I can try. Rosie smiled. You're hired. It became a rhythm, a steady pulse of normalcy that soothed the broken parts of her. She woke early, tied her apron around her waist, and opened the doors to the quiet buzz of early morning life. She learned how to make perfect cappuccinos, how to steam milk until it frothed just right, how to carry 3 plates at once without dropping them. She started to smile more, not forced but natural. And the customers noticed. Morning, Sophia, said an older man named George who came in every day at the same time for a black coffee and a blueberry muffin. Morning, George, she replied with a smile, setting down his usual order. You're looking brighter today, George said one morning, eyeing her carefully. Must be the coffee fumes, she joked. George chuckled. She started to feel happy. She made jokes with the regulars. She teased the teenage boys who lingered too long at the counter, eyeing her nervously. She learned the quirks of each customer, who liked their coffee extra hot, who preferred almond milk, who always left a generous tip. Rosie watched her from behind the counter one morning and smiled. I think you're starting to settle in, Rosie said. Sophia smiled faintly. I think so too. It happened on a quiet Thursday afternoon. The cafe was nearly empty, except for a young man sitting at the corner table with a book in his hand. He was tall, with dark hair that fell messily over his forehead and sharp green eyes that flicked up from the pages of his book every few minutes to watch her. She was wiping down the counter when he approached. Can I get a refill? he asked, holding up his empty cup. Sure, she said, taking it from him. She filled the cup and handed it back to him, their fingers brushing for a moment. He smiled. Thanks. No problem. He lingered. You know, he said, I've been coming here for a couple of weeks now. But I don't think I've caught your name. Sophia, she said. Oliver. He held out his hand. She hesitated, then shook it. Nice to meet you, Sophia, he said, his green eyes glinting. She smiled. Nice to meet you too. Oliver started coming in more often after that. Every morning he sat at the same table, book in hand, and ordered a coffee, black with just a little sugar. They started talking. What are you reading? She asked one afternoon, sitting across from him on her break. He lifted the book. Pride and Prejudice. Classic, she said. He smiled. You'd be surprised how much you can learn about people from Jane Austen. Really? For example, he said, closing the book and leaning closer, Elizabeth Bennet thought she knew everything about Darcy, until she realized she didn't. Her eyes narrowed. And what does that have to do with real life? Sometimes people surprise you, he said softly. Her heart fluttered. One night he waited until her shift ended and walked her home. So, he said, his hands in his pockets, you're not seeing anyone? She smiled faintly. No. What? That's interesting. She raised an eyebrow. Why? Because I was thinking of asking you out. Her heart skipped a beat. And what if I said no? Then I'd ask you again tomorrow. She smiled. Persistent. He grinned. I'm patient. Okay, she whispered. Okay. Okay, I'll go out with you. He smiled like he had just won the lottery. Oliver was different. He didn't play games. He didn't make her feel like she had to chase him or earn his affection. On their first date they went to a small Italian restaurant down the street. He held her hand across the table and made her laugh so hard she almost knocked over her glass of wine. Afterward, he walked her home and kissed her beneath the glow of the streetlights. It was soft, hesitant, and perfect. You make me happy, he whispered. Her heart tightened. You make me happy too. For the first time in a long time she felt light. She started smiling more. She stopped waking up with a hollow ache in her chest. And she stopped thinking about him. Emily called her once a week. So, you're happy? Emily asked one evening. I think so, Sophia said. And Oliver? He's good. Emily laughed. Good. Okay, he's amazing. I'm happy for you, Emily said. Sophia hesitated. Have you heard from him? Emily sighed. You mean him? Yeah. He's doing fine, Emily said carefully. Still dating around. He had a girlfriend for a while, but they broke up. Sophia's stomach twisted. He asked about you, though. Sophia's breath caught. What did he say? He wanted to know if you were happy. She hesitated. What did you say? I said yes. Sophia closed her eyes. Good, she whispered. Oliver became part of her life quickly. He would leave little notes for her on the coffee shop counter. You're beautiful written in the corner of her order pad. Dinner tonight? Scribbled on a napkin. He made her laugh. He kissed her like she was precious, like she was the only girl in the world. But sometimes, late at night when Oliver was asleep beside her, her thoughts drifted back to him. To the boy who had once held her hand and kissed her like she was everything, only to let her go without a fight. And sometimes, she still wondered why. But Oliver didn't hesitate. And maybe that was enough. She stood behind the cafe counter one morning, making Oliver's usual coffee when Rosie approached. You're happy, Rosie said. Sophia smiled. Yeah. And you're not looking back? Rosie asked carefully. Sophia paused. No, she said softly. Not anymore. Outside the window, Oliver stood beneath the streetlight, waiting for her with a smile on his face. Her heart swelled. She stepped out of the cafe and into his arms. You ready? He asked. She smiled. Yeah. This time she wasn't chasing anyone. This time she wasn't an option. This time she was exactly where she belonged. Sophia's life had finally settled into something steady, something calm. It had been months since she had thought about him, really thought about him. Oliver was everything she had hoped for. Kind, patient, loving. He didn't play games, didn't make her feel like she was walking on unstable ground. He cared for her without hesitation, without doubt. And most importantly, he showed it. Oliver never left her guessing. If he was happy, she knew. If he was upset, he talked to her about it. If he loved her, and he did, he made it clear. They were sitting at a quiet table at the cafe on a cool autumn evening. The glow from the streetlights reflected against the glass windows, and the low hum of conversation and soft music filled the air. Oliver had his arm draped casually over the back of her chair, his hand resting lightly against her shoulder. "You okay?" he asked, his gaze soft. She smiled. "I'm perfect." Oliver's eyes darkened slightly, a slow smile curling at the corner of his lips. "You know, if you keep saying things like that, I might start believing you actually like me." She laughed. "You figured that out just now?" He grinned, his thumb brushing lightly across her shoulder. "I'm slow sometimes." She leaned into him, warmth blooming in her chest. She felt safe, whole. For the first time in a long time, her heart wasn't weighed down by the ache of the past. She had moved on. Or so she thought. It happened so suddenly that it didn't feel real. The door to the cafe opened and a familiar figure walked in. Broad shoulders. Dark hair slightly tousled. Sharp eyes that cut through the dim lighting like a blade. Her breath hitched in her throat. Well, it couldn't be. But it was. He was there. He stood just inside the doorway, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on her. His gaze sharpened. His mouth tightened. His body went rigid. Sophia's entire body froze. Oliver's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Sophia." She couldn't speak. Her heart was thudding so loudly she could hear the echo in her ears. He crossed the room toward her with slow, deliberate steps. His gaze darkened as it moved from her to Oliver's hand resting casually against her shoulder. Oliver noticed it too. "Can I help you?" Oliver asked, his voice calm but firm. He didn't even look at him. His eyes stayed locked on hers. He ignored Oliver completely. His gaze burned into hers. "Is this serious?" Sophia's breath shook. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Her mind was spinning. Why was he here? Why now? After all this time, after months of silence, after he had made it painfully clear that he didn't love her. Why was he standing here like he had a right to demand answers from her? Oliver's eyes darkened. He sat up straighter, his hand sliding from her shoulder to her hand. "What's going on?" "Who are you?" Ethan asked coldly. Oliver's eyes flashed. "I'm her boyfriend." Ethan's eyes darkened dangerously. His mouth curled in something bitter. "Boyfriend?" Oliver's gaze sharpened. "That's right." Ethan's eyes narrowed. His gaze returned to hers. "So it's serious then?" Sophia's breath hitched. "What does it matter?" Oliver snapped. "She doesn't owe you an explanation." But he didn't even blink at Oliver's words. His attention stayed fixed on her, his gaze burning with something fierce and desperate. "Well?" he asked. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She felt Oliver's hand tighten around hers. Felt her heart beating painfully against her ribs. And then she stood. Without a word, she pushed back her chair and walked out of the cafe. "Sophia." Oliver called after her. But she kept walking. Her chest burned. Her head spun. She stepped out into the cold night air, trying to breathe through the tightness in her throat. She heard the door to the cafe swing open behind her. Heavy footsteps followed her down the sidewalk. "Sophia," Ethan called. She stopped but didn't turn. He walked toward her, his footsteps slow and measured. "Why does it matter?" she asked softly. He hesitated. "What?" She turned toward him, her eyes burning. "Why do you care if I'm dating someone? You made it clear you didn't want me." His mouth tightened. "You don't get to be angry about this," she said, her voice sharp. "You don't get to come back and act like you have any claim over me." His chest heaved as he stared at her, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "You walked away," she said coldly. "You made that choice. So why are you here now?" I made a mistake, he said quietly. Her heart slammed painfully against her ribs. What? I should never have let you go. Her throat tightened. You don't get to say that now. He stepped closer, his eyes burning. Why not? Because it's too late, she whispered. He closed his eyes briefly, his breath shaking. When he opened them again, his gaze was dark with frustration. I never stopped thinking about you, he said. Her eyes burned with tears. You never thought about me enough to stay. A long, tense silence hung between them. Finally, she shook her head. I need to go. She turned and walked away. He didn't stop her this time. It was 2 days later when Emily called. Sophia was sitting on the couch, Oliver's arm around her, the sound of the television droning softly in the background. She picked up her phone without looking at the screen. Hello. Sophia. Emily's voice was tight. Sophia sat up. Emily. It's him, Emily said quietly. Her chest tightened painfully. What about him? He's not doing well. Her stomach dropped. What? Emily's voice trembled. There's been a complication with his leg. Sophia's breath hitched. The doctors, they said it's serious this time. His mother called me. Her hand trembled. What did she say? She wants you to come, Emily whispered. She thinks, if you're there maybe he'll listen. Sophia's mouth went dry. Oliver shifted beside her. What's wrong? Sophia swallowed hard, tears burning behind her eyes. Tell his mother. I can't, she said softly. Emily's breath caught. Sophia. I can't keep doing this, she whispered. Sophia, please. She closed her eyes. I'm sorry. And then she hung up. Her hands were shaking as she set the phone down. Oliver brushed his hand against hers. What's wrong? She hesitated, then shook her head. Nothing, she whispered. Oliver's gaze darkened with quiet understanding. He wrapped his arms around her and pressed a soft kiss to her temple. I'm here, he whispered. She leaned into him, but her heart was pounding painfully in her chest. Because despite everything, some small, broken part of her still wanted to go. Sophia had made peace with her decision. She had closed that chapter, the chapter where she had loved someone who could never love her back. She had left behind the quiet ache of waiting for someone who wasn't capable of showing up when it mattered. Her life with Oliver was steady now, peaceful, safe, and she wasn't going to look back. But the past has a strange way of trying to pull you back in, especially when you think you've finally escaped it. It was early in the morning when her phone rang. The sound of it vibrating on the nightstand pulled her out of a light sleep. Sunlight was filtering through the cracks in the blinds, casting a soft glow across the room. She rubbed her eyes and reached for her phone. Unknown number. Her thumb hovered over the button. Part of her already knew who it was. Reluctantly she answered. Hello. Sophia, a familiar voice breathed. Her stomach tightened. Mrs. Bennet? Yes. Oh, thank God, his mother's voice trembled with relief. I've been trying to reach you for days. Sophia sat up slowly. Why? It's Ethan. Her chest tightened. He's not doing well, his mother said, her voice thick with emotion. There's been another complication with his leg. The doctor said it's serious this time. He might not recover fully. Sophia's hand trembled. I need you to come. Her eyes closed. Why? Because he listens to you, his mother said desperately. He needs someone to push him, to make him fight. He's shutting down, Sophia. Please. I know he'll listen to you. Sophia's mouth tightened. I'm not the person he listens to anymore. Please. Sophia hesitated. The sound of his mother's quiet sobs filled the silence. We can pay you, his mother added quickly. Anything you want. Just name your price. Sophia's heart twisted painfully. And then she remembered. She remembered the first time his mother had offered her money. When he had been broken, when she had stayed because she thought loving him was enough to make him love her back. She had stayed. She had given everything, her heart, her soul, her strength. And when he got better, he walked away without a second thought. She drew in a slow breath, her jaw tightening. "I'm sorry," she said coldly. "But I'm not doing that again. Sophia. I'm not coming." His mother's breath hitched. "But I already gave him everything I had," Sophia said sharply. "I'm not going to break myself again to fix him." Then she hung up. Her hand trembled as she set the phone down. She sat there for a long time, her chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. The ache beneath her ribs was familiar, but this time it was duller. She didn't owe him anything. Not anymore. That evening she sat across from Oliver at the small Italian restaurant they liked to visit on Friday nights. Candles flickered softly on the table between them, casting golden light across his handsome features. Oliver smiled at her, his green eyes glinting as he leaned toward her. "You've been quiet today," he said. "Something on your mind?" Sophia hesitated. There had always been a part of her that held back from Oliver, not because she didn't trust him, but because part of her had been too afraid to unpack everything that had happened with Ethan. But Oliver wasn't Ethan. And if she wanted to move forward with him, really move forward, she owed him the truth. "I got a call today," she said carefully. Oliver's smile faded. "From who?" "Ethan's mother." His brows lifted slightly. "Oh." She took a shaky breath. "He's not doing well. He's had some complications with his leg again." Oliver's expression darkened. "I see. She asked me to come see him," Sophia continued. Oliver's jaw tensed. "Did you?" "No," she said softly. Oliver's gaze softened. "Why not?" Sophia hesitated. "Because I'm not doing that again," she whispered. "I already spent so much of myself trying to fix him, trying to make him love me. And when he got better, he made it clear that I was nothing more than an option." Oliver's eyes darkened. "I loved him," Sophia admitted. "I loved him so much it hurt. And I thought, maybe if I stayed long enough, if I gave him everything, he'd finally love me back." Oliver's hand tightened over hers. "But he didn't," Sophia whispered. "And I can't let myself go back to that place. Not when I've finally found something real." Oliver's gaze softened. "And this is real?" She smiled faintly. "Yes." Oliver leaned forward, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "I'm not him, Sophia," he said quietly. "I know. You don't have to fix me. I know. And I'm never going to leave you wondering how I feel about you." Sophia smiled, her heart swelling. "I know." Oliver kissed her softly across the table. And this time she didn't feel like she was chasing something. She felt like she had finally caught it. It was 2 weeks later when she got the message. She was sitting in the park with Oliver, her head resting on his shoulder, when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer it, but something made her unlock the screen. "Ethan. I'm sorry." Her breath hitched. She stared at the message for a long moment, her heart pounding. Oliver shifted beside her. "What is it?" "Ethan," she whispered. Oliver's jaw tensed. "What does he want?" She swallowed hard and opened the message. "Ethan. I'm sorry for everything. I should have known what I had when I had it. You deserved more than what I gave you. I hope you're happy now. I needed to tell you that." Sophia's chest tightened painfully. A part of her had waited years to hear those words. But now that they were here, she realized they didn't matter anymore. She smiled faintly, fingers hovering over the screen before typing back. "Sophia. Thank you. I am happy. I hope you find happiness too." She set the phone down and leaned into Oliver's side. "You okay?" he asked softly. Sophia smiled. "Yeah." Oliver pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Good." Sophia exhaled slowly. That ache in her chest, the one Ethan had left behind, was finally gone. She had closure. Real closure. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't need anything more. Life continued, but this time it didn't feel heavy. She went to work at the cafe. Oliver waited for her every evening after her shift. They held hands as they walked through the city. They talked about the future, not in vague terms but real plans. She didn't wonder if Oliver loved her. She didn't wonder if he would stay. She already knew. One evening as they stood on the balcony of her apartment, Oliver pulled her close. His eyes burned into hers, steady and sure. "I love you," he whispered. Sophia smiled. "I love you too." This time, there was no hesitation. This time she wasn't chasing anything. She had finally found exactly what she deserved. Vendi.